For hundreds of years, Native American and Alaska Native communities have experienced unique injustice rooted in colonization and broken treaties. Long before the United States existed, Indigenous nations had their own laws, lands, and livelihoods. Beginning in the 1600s, European colonists and later the U.S. federal government began claiming native lands and resources. This process was often justified by racist ideas like the so-called Doctrine of Discovery and enforced through war, coerced treaties, and forced removals. In the early United States, treaties were used to acquire native land. By 1871, the U.S. had signed over 350 treaties with tribes. In many cases, these treaties promised land, resources, or autonomy to tribes. Promises that were often broken or ignored. During the 1830s to 50s, for example, the Indian Removal Act forced eastern tribes such as Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles onto western lands in what became Oklahoma. These brutal relocations, epitomized by the Trail of Tears, led to thousands of deaths. Later in the 19th century, U.S. policy confined striped tribes to ever-shrinking reservations. The General Allotment Act, Dow's Act of 1887, divided communal lands into private plots. Tribal land holdings plummeted from about 138 million acres to just 48 million by 1934. This massive loss of land destroyed traditional economies and community structures. At the same time, federal policies aimed to erase native cultures. From the late 1800s to the 20th century, the government ran hundreds of Indian boarding schools across the country. Native children were taken from their families and punished for speaking their language or practicing their traditions. In 2024, President Joe Biden issued a formal apology, acknowledging that a century of boarding school policy had sought to erase the identities of Indigenous children. Scholars note that these forced assimilations, plus military attacks and missions, inflicted deep trauma upon the native lands and communities. U.S. law treats tribes as domestic dependent nations with certain rights. Federal Indian law is founded on the Constitution, treaties, and Supreme Court rulings. In theory, this means a trust relationship. The federal government must protect tribal interests even while recognizing tribal sovereignty. For example, early Supreme Court cases affirmed that tribes have authority over internal affairs. Today, tribal nations can make their own laws, run courts, and manage reservations. Tribal sovereignty is the inherent right of Indigenous nations to govern themselves, and it is protected by the U.S. constitutions and treaties. Native American communities face stark gaps in wealth, income, and opportunity. Today, poverty and unemployment rate are far above the national averages. For example, a 2022 report found that roughly 25% of Native Americans lived in poverty, about double the rate for the U.S. overall. In rural tribal areas, rates can be far higher. The Standing Rock Sioux Reservation had about 43% poverty rate in recent years. Jobs and industry are often scarce on reservations. In December of 2021, the unemployment rate for American Indians and Alaska Natives was about 7.9% compared to the 3.9% for overall population. High unemployment and low wages make it hard for many families to get by. President Barack Obama once called Native high school dropout and poverty rates a moral call to action, underscoring that education and income inequalities remain urgent problems. Housing and infrastructure are also serious issues. Many Native households lack basic amenities. A national report found Native homes are about 19 times more likely than white homes to have no indoor plumbing or clean water. In places like the Navajo Nation, roughly 1/3 of homes have no running water or electricity. Overcrowding and substandard housing are common on reservations and in urban Native neighborhoods alike. These socioeconomic conditions contribute to other gaps. For example, poor housing often leads to worse health outcomes. Despite resilience and new economic developments, like tribal businesses and energy projects, the legacy and disinvestment means that Native communities struggle against enriched poverty and inequality. Native Americans suffer disproportionately poor health outcomes compared to other groups. On average, Native life expectancy is 5.5 years shorter than for all Americans, about 73 years versus 78.5 years. In many categories of illness and injury, Indigenous people die at higher rates. For instance, U.S. health data shows that heart disease and cancer are leading causes of death for American Indians and Alaska Natives, as they are for other Americans. but rates of diabetes, chronic liver disease, and an unintentional injury are especially high. In fact, diabetes mortality among Native communities is multiple times higher than the national average. Another startling fact, among Native youth, suicides is an urgent crisis. In 2022, suicide was the second leading cause of death for non-Hispanic Native Americans, aged 10 to 34, far higher than most other ethnic groups. Mental health disorders like depression and anxiety are also more prevalent, exacerbated by historical trauma and lack of access to care. Part of these disparities come down to access to healthcare. The Indian Health Service, IHS, a federal agency, is supposed to provide care for Native communities, but resources have been limited. The IHS serves about 2.56 million people, roughly half of the 5.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives nationwide. Many Native people live in remote or rural reservations where hospitals and clinics are scarce. Long distances, understaffed facilities, and cultural barriers can make it hard to get timely medical help. Also, many Native adults lack health insurance. As of 2023, about 23.5% of Native adults, ages 18 to 64, were uninsured, compared to about 10% of the U.S. population. These gaps in coverage force Native patients to rely on an underfunded IHS or limited tribal clinics. Cultural stereotypes and outright prejudice have long harmed Native communities. For generations, school textbooks and media told a narrow version of history, often ignoring Native perspectives or repeating myths like the vanishing Indian. Native cultures were actively suppressed. Religious practices and languages were banned, the children at boarding schools were shamed of their heritage, and in 2024, the US government formally apologized for this policy of cultural erasure. Such historical racism continues in subtler forms today. For example, many sports teams and brands have used exaggerated Native-themed mascots or imagery. The National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, has campaigned against these harmful stereotypes, noting that unsanctified, Native-themed mascots degrade and mock Indigenous people. Pop cultures still too often portray Indians as primitive or one-dimensional, which contributes to misunderstandings and bias in society. Violence against Native people is another tragic dimension of systemic racism. Native American and Alaska Native women, in particular, face extremely high rates of assault and murder. Studies show that 84% of Native women have experienced some forms of violence in their lifetime. In 2020, homicide was among the top 10 causes of death for Native women aged 1 to 45. Community advocates trace this crisis to a history of oppression, years of forced removals, broken treaties, and legal loopholes that have left the Native communities especially vulnerable. Even in everyday life, many Native people report experiencing discrimination, from being targeted with slurs or refusing to be served, to courts and police ignoring their rights. Environmental harms have disproportionately impacted Native lands and communities. Across the country, Indigenous territories are often chosen for polluting industries and resource extraction, while tribal voices are sidelined. A well-known example in the Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL, near the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. When pipeline planners wanted to move an oil pipeline, they abandoned a route near the largely white city of Bismarck to spare that city's water supply, and instead approved a route near the Standing Rock Reservation. Critics noted this showed a troubling double standard. An oil spill on the tribe-owned land would threaten drinking water and sacred sites for the Sioux, even though they had protested it. The tribe argued that the project violated treaty guarantees of their water rights and land protections. Water access illustrates a broader issue. Many Native communities lack clean, reliable water, simply because of infrastructure neglect. A recent report found that Native American households are about 19 times more likely than white households to lack indoor plumbing and safe drinking water. Some tribal areas must haul water from wells or rivers, limiting hygiene and health. Pollution from mining and industrial waste further contaminates groundwater on or nearby many reservations. Native American communities have historically had very limited political power in the U.S. government. Tribal nations are self-governing, but their citizens are underrepresented in state and federal politics. Alarmingly, Native Americans make up about 3.4% of the U.S. population, but hold only 0.07% of all elected positions. By one measure, a record 6 Indigenous members were in Congress in 2020, out of 435 House seats and 100 Senate seats. This vast underrepresentation means Native voices have little clout in legislatures and courts. Native voters also face unique barriers. Election officials have often placed polling stations far from reservations or refuse to accept tribal ID cards, which are sometimes the only available IDs for reservation residents. The inequities faced by Native American communities are systemic, not accidental. They result of centuries of land seizure, forced assimilation, racist policies, and economic neglect. We have seen how historical actions, broken treaties, removal, land loss, and cultural bans set the stage for today's gaps in health, wealth, and power. We've also seen how contemporary laws and practices often perpetuate these old injustices, whether in education, healthcare, or voting rights. Yet there is hope in awareness and action. In recent decades, new laws and tribal initiatives have begun reversing some harms. The self-determination era policies of 1970s onward have led to a stronger tribal governments. Native-led organizations and allies continue to push forwards for equity, for clean water, good schools, accurate history education, and the honoring of treaties. The Joe Biden administration apology and other gestures acknowledging past wrongings, but the work of healing and justice is ongoing.